6 bridges in a single night. By dawn, one of Iran's critical ports was effectively severed from the rest of the country. Not a radar array, not a patrol craft, but the roads themselves, the actual arteries that move fuel, weapons, and supplies for Iran's armed forces were taken out in just a few hours. And this was no accident. Analysts following this conflict in detail say this was the moment the entire strategy pivoted. Before we unpack exactly what went down, if you've been following this series night after night, do one quick thing for me. Hit subscribe. Tap that notification bell, and you'll get every new update the second it drops. Because right now, this war is genuinely shifting day by day. And I always want to hear this from you. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. It's honestly one of my favorite parts of doing this. Now, let's break down what happened, because this marks a real turning point early on Friday, July 17th, 2026. The United States widened its air operations against Iran in a way we hadn't seen before. Multiple outlets tracking the campaign reported that U.S. forces struck bridges overnight in Iran's southern Hormuzgan province, hitting the coastal city of Bandar Abbas near the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian state. TV said at least 7 people were killed in that particular wave of attacks. In total, at least 7 major road and rail bridges were targeted, along with a rail junction on the Bandar Abbas line, and an airport farther east inside Iran. A port control tower was also reported to have collapsed during the same operation. This was not random, scattered damage. It was a clean cut by design. The bridges that were hit carried traffic out of Bandar Abbas, which houses the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Navy's headquarters on the coast and north toward Shiraz, then into central Iran, and ultimately toward Tehran itself. Think about what that means in practical terms. Bandar Abbas is not just another port. It's arguably Iran's single most important logistics lifeline for anything moving near the Strait of Hormuz. Weapons flow through it. Fuel flows through it. IRGC supplies flow through it. Destroy the roads and rail lines, linking that port to the rest of the country, and you're not just smashing concrete and steel. You're slicing through a supply chain. Doesn't matter how many missiles the military has in storage if it physically can't transport them from depots to launch sites. That's why some analysts are calling this a logistic siege. No ground invasion, no occupying troops. Just a methodical strangling of the supply web from the air. The immediate local fallout came quickly. Hormuzgan's provincial authorities confirmed that roads into Bandar Abbas were blocked. Then later said Trafa had begun creeping through again and urged residents to avoid traveling unless absolutely necessary. And in a detail that matters more than it might sound at first, Iran's own energy ministry urged people across the southern provinces to cut back on electricity use, officially blaming extreme heat, but also, for the first time openly, admitting that parts of the national power system had been damaged by the strikes. That's a major admission. Tehran was acknowledging in its own public messaging that the campaign was already beginning to hit the electrical grid even before any of the larger power station strikes President Trump had repeatedly threatened. This bridge operation also didn't come out of nowhere. It followed directly on the heels of another major step up just one night earlier. On Tuesday, before any of the bridge attacks began, the U.S. reinstated a full naval blockade around Iran's ports. Commercial shipping was bluntly warned to stay away from Iranian oil terminals. Most captains complied. One did not. According to CENTCOM, the Curacao-flagged tanker Mount Ben, an empty vessel about 100 feet in length, ignored multiple warnings and continued steaming toward Kharg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. A U.S. aircraft responded by launching Hellfire missiles into the ship, crippling it without puncturing its tanks or causing an oil spill. The tanker sharply veered away from Kharg Island shortly after being hit. According to vessel tracking data reviewed by Bloomberg, no one was injured, but the signal sent to every other tanker operator watching was unmistakable. Try to run the blockade and you will be stopped. Then, just one night after the beluga was disabled, the bridge strikes began. 2 separate operations, one at sea and one on land. Both aimed squarely at the same objective, cutting Iran off from the resources it needs to keep its war machine running. Iran did not remain silent. In retaliation, Iranian forces launched missiles at neighboring states hosting American troops, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. Ironically, one of the key mediators trying to broker peace in this conflict were all struck. And for the first time since this war began, One of those retaliatory hits crossed into truly new territory. A missile damaged a power and water desalination facility inside Kuwait. Multiple outlets verified that report. That detail is huge. A desalination plant is not a H-5 conventional military target. It's civilian infrastructure that supplies drinking water to an entire country in a small desert state that is totally dependent on it. Hitting that kind of facility isn't just another step up in military pressure. It's the kind of escalation that starts touching normal people who have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. So, where does that leave us this week? A naval blockade fully back in force. The bridge network tying Iran's most crucial port to the interior shattered. A desalination plant struck inside a US-aligned Gulf nation. And Iran's own energy ministry publicly conceding for the first time that its power grid has already taken hits. In the next section, we're going to look at how much this shift has already reached Iran's actual fighting capacity, including a jaw-dropping claim from President Trump about more than 100 missiles launched at a single U.S. aircraft carrier, and what experts think that tells us about where this war heads next. Let's talk about just how much pressure this dual strategy, blockade at sea, bridge strikes on land, has actually put on Iran's ability to continue the fight, because the emerging numbers are getting hard to dismiss. Reports circulating this week suggest Iran's daily missile launch rate has fallen sharply compared with just a few weeks ago, dropping to what some monitoring groups describe as only around a dozen launches per day. That's a steep decline from the tempo Iran maintained at certain points earlier in the war. Specialists studying the pattern believe this is a direct result of the blockade in the bridge campaign working in tandem. If the ground routes tying missile production and storage sites to the coast are destroyed, and the ports themselves are sealed off by an active naval and air cordon, then new munitions simply can't be moved to the locations they'd need to be fired from. It's a strategy based on endurance rather than a single knockout blow, wearing down an opponent's capabilities one transport link at a time, all without any American troops crossing onto Iranian territory. Then there's the claim that, if broadly accurate, says a lot about how effective U.S. missile defenses have become in this particular theater. Speaking on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey on July 8th, President Trump told reporters that Iran had fired 111 missiles at the Abraham Lincoln, a U.S. aircraft carrier deployed in the region within roughly 1 hour, and that every single one was They didn't hit the ship, Trump said. And you know what would have happened if they did it important, to be exact here. This account came straight from Trump, and at the time reporting indicated it had not yet been independently verified or formally confirmed by the Pentagon. But if the broad outline is correct, it would rank as one of the most significant real-world demonstrations of layered air and missile defense capabilities in this war. And it fits within a larger pattern. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been operating on CENTCOM since January, supported by ARLA, Burke-class destroyers equipped with their own missile defense systems, with a second carrier group also active in the area. Whether the exact number was 111 or something close, the core assertion that U.S. naval defenses in this region are currently intercepting, essentially. Everything Iran throws at them is the kind of fact that shapes how confident Washington feels as it escalates. That confidence is visible in troop levels as well. According to coverage of the military buildup, the U.S. now has more than 50,000 personnel stationed across the Middle East, up from the roughly 40,000 typically present at any given time across bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. Recent deployments, including the amphibious assault ship Tripoli carrying thousands of additional Marines and F-35 fighters, have pushed this into what many are calling the largest U.S. military buildup in the region since Tehran. Wow. Officials describe these forces as on high alert and prepared to act if necessary. Is that simply a defensive shield to protect existing assets or groundwork for something broader? No one in an official capacity is spelling that out, but it's exactly the magnitude that keeps regional analysts on edge. Meanwhile, along the coast, one specific site has kept reappearing in strike reports throughout this campaign. The Chabahar Port's control tower. This latest attack marked the at least third time U.S. forces had hit that same structure. And this time, according to reports, it was fully destroyed. Alongside that, smaller roads linking nearby towns and villages to the same main supply artery toward the shoreline were also targeted. And none of this is being done with a single weapon platform. It's a synchronized combination of fighter jets, drones, and naval vessels all operate over the same coastline and the inland routes feeding into it. That makes manned aircraft, unmanned systems, and warships all watching the same patches of water and road at once is crucial to understand because it's a big part of why Iran's options are shrinking. Long-endurance surveillance drones can orbit above a single target vessel for hours before a strike is even considered. covering far more ocean than any single plane or ship could monitor on its own. Some of these platforms are specifically designed to stay largely unseen for extended periods. And instead of sinking targets outright, the favorite tactic increasingly seems to be disabling without destroying, exactly what was done to the Belma near Kharg Island. That difference matters a lot diplomatically. A disabled ship sends a firm warning without inevitably creating a global incident. A sunken one, particularly involving a third country flag, risks doing exactly that. Put all of this together, a missile launch rate cut down to a fraction of what it was, a naval blockade actively enforced with real penalties for violators, bridges and rail lines linking Iran's key port left in ruins, a control tower destroyed on the third attempt, and a president publicly talking about carriers missile salvos being intercepted at or near 100% rate. You start to see why many observers are calling this a genuine inflection point rather than just another round of headlines. In the next section, we'll step beyond the Gulf and look at developments in Ukraine and elsewhere that some analysts argue are more entangled with this story than they first appear, and what Iran's deeper long-range objective in all of this might really be. While Iran's bridges were being dropped and tankers were being crippled in the Gulf, a completely different kind of upheaval was playing out in another war zone, and the link between the two is closer than it looks on the surface. In Ukraine, massive protests erupted in Kyiv on Thursday, July 16th, after President Volodymyr Zelensky fired his defense minister. Mikhailo Fedorov, just 35, had only held the top job for 6 months. But in that short span, he was widely praised for supercharging Ukraine's drone warfare efforts, the same program that let Ukraine hit deep targets inside Russia and disrupt Moscow's energy infrastructure. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered near Kyiv's Ivan Franko National Theater chanting shame, with similar protests spreading to Odessa and Denis. Fedorov did not go quietly either. He openly criticized Ukraine's top general Oleksandr Syrsky, accusing the leadership of making decisions based on loyalty instead of hard data and questioning whether Ukraine could actually win with Syrsky in charge of the army. It's the most visible internal split inside Ukraine's defense establishment since the war with Russia began, and it unfolded the very same week, when both Ukrainian and Iranian battlefields were in the global spotlight. Here's why that's relevant to our story. Ukraine has not been completely on the sidelines in the Iran confrontation. Earlier this year, when direct US aid to Ukraine was temporarily halted, American officials actually turned to Kyiv for help countering Iranian-designed drones, the same shaded-type drones Tehran has supplied to Russia for use in Ukraine. Zelensky agreed to send Ukrainian military specialists into the Gulf region to help study the situation and support safe shipping lanes, with Fedorov himself describing it as Ukrainian experts working on the ground to support real, practical efforts in the area. In other words, the same official just removed from his post amid protests in Kyiv until recently, one of the people helping coordinate Ukraine's technical support against Iranian design systems. Losing a leading drone strategist in the middle of an active war, whatever the internal reasons, is exactly the kind of disruption that can echo outward. And that's what analysts mean when they argue that modern conflicts rarely stay fully isolated from one another anymore. Now, back to the central question, overshadowing everything happening in the Gulf. What is Iran actually trying to accomplish? Publicly, Tehran portrays this entire conflict as defensive, guarding its sovereignty, resisting external pressure, and standing up to what it calls foreign aggression. But many observers, who've been mapping the pattern of events over the last several weeks, believe the real objective is significantly larger, long-term, durable leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, not just wartime control that evaporates the moment a ceasefire is signed. The numbers explain why that prize is so valuable. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow choke point every day. Any country able to quietly hold lasting leverage over that passage without ever fully closing it would gain major influence over the global economy, simply through the constant possibility of disruption, missiles on standby, patrol craft ready to harass commercial ships, and a covert fleet of unmarked tankers set up to move oil outside the bounds of sanctions and standard regulations. Some analysts have started calling this a toll booth strategy. Iran doesn't have to completely shut the strait to gain power from it. It only needs the rest of the world to believe it could do so at any time if pushed. Shandatwayan incident from weeks ago looks very different, when Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels despite an active ceasefire earlier this year. Many early commentators framed it as a blunder, an isolated avoidable mistake. Looking back now, more and more experts interpret it as a deliberate probe, a test to see whether the US would really respond with force or quietly look away to protect a fragile peace agreement, judging by everything that has followed. The naval blockade, more than a week of continuous strikes, destroyed command sites, and now bridges linking Iran's main port turned into Ruva. The answer to that test is crystal clear. The US did not look away. For aids, Tehran, that likely wasn't the outcome it had wagered on. A strategy built around probing red lines without crossing into full-scale war appears for the moment to have backfired badly. Missile output is sharply reduced. The key supply routes into its most important port have been cut. Its shadow fleet operations are directly threatened, as we saw with the Belma strike off Kharg Island, by nearly every visible metric. Iran now finds itself in a weaker position than it held only weeks ago. Yet analysts warn against assuming this means the conflict is close to burning out. Iran's central strategic ambition, long-term leverage over the world's most important oil choke point, hasn't vanished just because some of its immediate tools have been damaged, even from a diminished position. Tehran may keep searching for new ways to exert pressure. Proxy groups across the region, whatever remains of its grey market tanker network, or renewed efforts to test the limits of any future ceasefire, the way it tested the last one. On Tiwa Sea, the stance appears solid for now, with over 50,000 troops in the theater, to carrier strike groups at sea, and officials treating an open Strait of Hormuz as non-negotiable. This is increasingly looking less like a short-term response and more like a long-haul posture. In the final section, we'll walk through where experts think this realistically goes from here, and what the destruction of Iran's bridges specifically signals about how long this conflict may still have to run. So, let's pull all of this together, because after everything we've covered, the bridges cut around Bandar Abbas, the tanker disabled off Kharg Island, a desalination plant hit in Kuwait, and a defense shakeup in Kyiv that's more connected than it seems. The underlying question is straightforward. What does taking down Iran's bridges in one night really tell us about the direction of this war? First, it tells us the conflict has clearly moved beyond just destroying weapons and defensive systems. For weeks, this campaign followed a relatively predictable pattern. Coastal radar patrol craft, command facilities, missile depots. Bridges are a completely different class of objective. They're not weapons. They're not traditional military bases. They're the physical backbone that lets a country function, moving fuel, moving food, moving military hardware. But also just getting workers to their jobs and products to markets. Once infrastructure like that becomes a normal repeated target, the nature of the war changes. It becomes much harder to reverse. You can rebuild some level of trust after a volley of missiles. It's far more difficult to rebuild trust after a country's basic transport network has been systematically dismantled segment by segment. That's really the thread tying together everything we've talked about in every part of this story. Command nodes hit to disrupt Iran's coordination. Naval blockade reimposed to choke what moves at sea. Bridges destroyed to sever what moves by land. A desalination plant in an allied country damaged in retaliation. Each one on its own might look like a standalone headline. Viewed together, they form one clear pattern. A war that has widened from hitting an enemy's weapons to targeting the systems that keep an entire nation, and increasingly its neighbors, operated. So, where does this plausibly lead? Analysts who study these trajectories usually outline a few main paths, and none of them is guaranteed. The first is a slow, grinding de-escalation under continued pressure. The blockade, the reported drop in missile launches to a fraction of previous levels. The bridge is gone, eventually forcing